Hey everybody, welcome to Mossback, the official podcast of the Mossback's Northwest video series from Cascade PBS. I'm Stephen Hegg.
And I'm Knute Berger.
And today, we're talking about the deadliest avalanche in U.S. history and Canadian history. In the winter of 1910, an avalanche struck a railroad outpost in Washington's central Cascades. A few days later, another one hit railroad workers in British Columbia. Between the two, more than 150 people died. What happened in the aftermath? And what connections do these disasters have to our world today? If you haven't already seen the video, take a few moments to watch it. It'll make this conversation more interesting and relevant. You can find the video in the show notes, but for now, let's brave the storm. Knute, avalanche risk is a real thing in the Northwest, and we do hear about deadly ones from time to time. It seems that most victims now are those who are in the backcountry for recreation and in the wrong place at the wrong time. But this one in 1910 set the record in both the U.S. and Canada. How did you come across this, and what made you want to look into it?
I had heard kind of about Wellington, which is the railroad town where the avalanche occurred. I heard that it was a great disaster. I just heard that, I don't know, growing up, reading references to it. They turned that railroad right-of-way into a hiking trail. And so I went up to Stevens Pass one time just on my own, and you can hike down essentially to the scene of this disaster. So I knew that there was an avalanche there. It had hit a train. And then when I was doing some research, I came across the fact that just a couple of days later, there was a similar avalanche up in the Selkirks in British Columbia. There's the phenomenon we have of the Pineapple Express.
Pineapple Express is trending for a reason tonight, a rare superstorm.
Which brings a lot of water from the Pacific to the Pacific Northwest and the West Coast.
It could set a record today if the waters continue to rise.
People have seen the kind of destruction those can do in California, and we have them fairly routinely here in the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah, and for us, it's just a lot of warm air, a lot of rain. We don't seem to think about how destructive or how potentially destructive a Pineapple Express could be. It seems so friendly in a way.
Well, yeah, it has kind of a friendly name. Atmospheric river gives you kind of a different image. The amount of moisture being transferred in a Pineapple Express can meet or exceed the outflow of the Mississippi River falling on you. Well, when you combine rain and snow in steep mountain slopes, that is a recipe for avalanches. The transcontinental railroads had to get over the mountains. The Great Northern built a line near, Stevens Pass. Wellington was a railroad community that was just on the west side of Stevens Pass, and they got caught in a big storm.
Set the scene of the 1910 catastrophe. There are two trains near Stevens Pass, near Wellington, in late February 1910, and I gather a lot of snow piled up. So what happened?
So there were two express trains headed for Seattle from the east side to the west side. There was the Seattle-Spokane Express, which was a passenger train, and there was a fast mail express train that was coming through. The Pineapple Express swept through the Cascades and dumped a huge amount of snow, and it blocked the tracks. The trains couldn't go forward, and they were stuck.
And they couldn't clear the tracks.
They couldn't clear the tracks. They tried a number of things. Of course, they had these big rotary snowplow. They were like giant engines, but the front was a great disc that would spin and cut through the snow. Well, this was Cascade concrete. It was kind of that wet snow. It was really deep, and the rotary snowplows couldn't get through. They got stuck.
Wow.
They also brought in railroad workers, and these were largely immigrant laborers who were there to shovel snow and try and clear the tracks as best they could. But essentially, they were just stuck there, and it turned out they were stuck there for nearly a week.
Yeah, let's do one more with the wide shot. And action.
So for the video shoot of this story, you took a trip to the Northwest Railway Museum at Snoqualmie, partly to show what the rail car that people were stuck in was like. What was that like?
Well, the Railway Museum is fascinating because it had a lot of stock, rolling stock of the exact vintage or very close to vintage of what was at Wellington. We're standing in front of, it's a Northern Pacific engine, so it's not Great Northern, but it's the same era. It's early 1900s. This is the kind of locomotive that was wiped out by the avalanche. And there's a passenger car from that era that they're in the process of restoring. Like I say, this passenger car, we're going to be in, they're reupholstering the whole thing to what it would have been back in the early 1900s. I have to haul myself up. Yeah, so all this velour, whatever you call it, is being replaced. They're going to use it. They're going to, when it's done, it'll be carrying passengers. They are able to take people on rides in this antique equipment. The passengers basically, were stuck in here except for mealtime. They could go up to, there was a small inn, but at night they were sleeping. The lion's share of the passengers were sleeping in their seats or in the car, with coats and blankets. And you can see that they're not insulated for being stuck in a snowstorm for day after day. It would have gotten old really fast. It's not like those cars are insulated for the cold. It's not like they don't have kitchens. It's, this was meant to be, a train that got to and from Seattle very quickly. So nobody was prepared to camp out, which is what you would have to do. They were getting concerned because the weather wasn't improving. And the trains were on the track at the base of a very steep mountainside. And that mountainside had previously had a fire on it, a forest fire. So there were very few trees or anything that might block snow coming down.
So there's no walking out of this place.
Yeah, I mean, there is for the hardy or the foolhardy. There were people who were able to scramble down the mountain, but the passengers weren't. I mean, you're talking about, these are people they're not dressed for the cold. They're businessmen, they're families with children, they're traveling salesmen.
And they're probably thinking, just a few more hours and they're gonna be able to clear the tracks. Just a few more hours, everything will be okay.
Yeah. I think at first, it was just a kind of a minor inconvenience. And as time went on and as the weather failed to improve, people got more and more worried.
Was there actually a knowledge that there could be an avalanche, or was it just a worry about getting the rest of this snow out of the way so we can get on our way?
No. There was a worry about, and that came through in testimony from the survivors. People who were observing what was happening were concerned. And the anxiety that they had regarding the fact that they were perfectly aware that there was a big slope of snow right above them with no shelter or anything. They could see the position they were in, and they were nervous about it, and they complained about it. The engine is up ahead.
At the museum, did they have any of the snowplows, the rotary snowplows?
They have a rotary snowplow of exactly the vintage.
Really?
Yeah. These snowplows are still used. The technology is very similar. You can see it's got a really powerful engine, and then it has this rotary front end. They're massive machines. You don't get a sense of how big they are until you stand in front of one. I guess I almost reached the middle of the rotary thing, but I feel pretty dwarfed by it. And you have this, massive road. It's kind of like a mini version of Bertha, the tunneling machine. It's essentially what they are, except it got stuck in the snow as opposed to stuck underground. They often had an engine so they could be driven on the tracks, or sometimes they had other engines pushing them through. And you could see they were for the heavy lifting, in clearing the tracks, and not just in the mountains, but in the prairies and other places where the snow could get really deep. But then they would also, have platoons of shovelers who would follow the plow and do additional track clearing. And then imagine, the avalanche coming and knocking that, take a real whammy to move that thing sideways, right? So yes, they have one at Snoqualmie. It's parked out on the highway. People drive by it and probably think, oh, what's that funny, black, weird-looking train engine? Well, that's what it is. And those were exactly the kind of machines that were at Wellington. Yeah.
So everybody's cold, hungry, afraid, and then the avalanche hits.
So on February 28th, the snow that has been falling turns to rain, and there's a very unusual thunderstorm occurs that night. So the thunder is loud enough that it's shaking the windows of the car. So these people are already scared, and now they're waking up in the wee hours hearing the storm going on outside. Suddenly the mountain lets loose. This giant avalanche comes down. It hits both trains, drives them into the ravine down the hill. It took some of these rotary snowplows and other engines and other train baggage cars, you name it, everything just got, totally wiped out.
And then 3 days later, up in British Columbia, the same thing happened.
Yeah, and again, another sort of avalanche express situation, Rogers Pass, Canadian Pacific line through the Selkirk Mountains. A train was headed for Vancouver, passenger train. They stopped the train further away than the block pass, so the passengers were stalled and safe, and they were clearing the tracks ahead. They had a bunch of mostly immigrant workers, Japanese, and I think some Eastern European day workers who were out there with shovels. And same thing happened late at night while they were working. A steep slope of a mountain there let loose and buried the crew that was trying to clear the tracks.
Going back to the Cascades, who died? Do we know?
Yeah, well, most of the passengers on the train were killed. There were 96 people in all, including the majority were railroad workers. So you had, mail clerks, conductors, engineers, baggage handlers, cooks, all the people that it takes to run a railroad, But you also had this large casualty of the passengers. And this was particularly poignant, I think, and horrifying to people. There were 23 survivors of the passenger car. But there's an immediate beginning of searching to dig people out. And, occasionally they're finding somebody who's alive. More often they're finding people who are dead. It becomes a very kind of traumatic event. I mean, if you read the news coverage at the time, it was a huge deal. It was like the sinking of the Titanic locally, in the sense that all these people were headed for Seattle or for the West Side. There were whole families. There were children. And people, I think, really related to it. I mean, it would be like if there was a Boeing aircraft crashed full of Seattleites right outside of town. It had that kind of effect. One of the things that strikes me about it is how the word horror is actually almost part of the title. It's referred to, I have headlines here, it's referred to consistently as the Wellington horror.
Well, it sounds like a horror movie.
Exactly. And I think it was particularly traumatic for people in the Puget Sound area.
The analogy of the Titanic came to me as well, especially all of these people getting on this technological marvel, and then they hit nature.
Yeah.
The worst that nature can throw at them.
Yep.
Unexpectedly. And then we are still finding out about the victims. So many years later, we're still finding out about the victims of the Wellington disaster. We're still finding out about the victims of the Titanic. In Canada, the other avalanche in the Selkirks, who died there?
Yeah, it was mostly, in fact, almost entirely the employees who were clearing the tracks. And in both Wellington and in Rogers Pass, these were mostly immigrants. They were day workers. Often the railroad didn't even know their names, hadn't even written their names down. I think there was one maybe engineer who died or something like that, but it was mostly the track workers.
How quickly did the news media report this, and what was some of the reporting like?
So it took a little while for word to get out because at Wellington, the telegraph lines were down, the means of communication. Now, back in those days, they had railroad depots or railroad support towns, at some intervals. But there's a headline here from the Spokane newspaper about a guy named A.J. Mackey who took messages and was able to hike down the mountain through this terrible weather and get far enough to be able to tell somebody at a telegraph what had happened so they could get the word out. But it took at least a day or so for anybody to hear about it. There was an awareness that these trains had been delayed. There was awareness that the weather was bad. And I should point out, the weather continued to be bad. It wasn't like the weather suddenly cleared. Newspapers, once they were able to get reporters and photographers, up there, covered it extensively. It was front page news. There's a lot of rumors about how many died. The numbers are inexact. Blame works its way into stories. What could the railroad have done better? Were they negligent? Did the track workers walk off the job? It's true that the day before the avalanche, the Italian immigrants and others who were hired to clear the tracks were being paid 15 cents an hour, working in absolutely miserable conditions. They wanted a raise. They wanted to make 17 or 18 cents an hour. And some of them just said phooey and, hiked out.
So they were able to get out of there.
Yes. But the question is raised, did they put these people in further jeopardy by not working? You can see in a lot of the coverage, racial prejudice immediately kind of comes to the fore, where the white people are identified, but the immigrant workers are just referred to as, 30 Japanese dead, and this is both at Rogers Pass and Wellington. You can also see there are issues that have to do with kind of longer term racial and worker labor strife happening within the railroad. So at Rogers Pass, some of the workers who came in to clean up the mess and dig out the dead became furious with being sort of driven in miserable conditions to do this work and are alleged to have attacked one of the bosses, who's running the team. There was a similar incident in Leavenworth shortly after Wellington where Japanese workers got really fed up with how they were being treated. Immigrant labor had been controversial ever since the railroads were under construction. In this particular case, one accusation that was made early on was that some of the rescue workers who were Italian track workers were brought in and they were attempting to loot some of the bodies. And this was reported using, a ethnic slur in a headline in the Seattle Times. Here's a passage from the Seattle Times by their reporter, J.J. Underwood, who was one of the first newspaper reporters there. He says, "The horror of it grows every minute. As if the appalling list of casualties were not enough, the last touch was added when a number of Italian workmen began robbing the bodies of the dead. This was Tuesday morning, immediately after the catastrophe. The railroad authorities took prompt action and drove the ghouls from their ghastly work before the arrival of the deputy sheriffs. There were people who, I think, questioned that some of these railroad workers had walked off the job because they were only making 15 cents an hour and had complained, and the railroad said it wouldn't pay anymore. And that was raised both as, did they shirk their duty and these people died as a result, but also was raised as, well, the railroad could have done more to save people. Why didn't they pay a few cents an hour more to these workers and keep them on the job? In the Rogers Pass, here's a headline from the Spokane newspaper. It's talking about the death toll there, most of which were track workers, most of them immigrants, a large number of them Japanese. The headline reads, recovered 30 bodies, 22 whites found. That's the headline, is the race of the white people, So there's a lot of, the racially infused politics and culture and whatnot surfaces, in these disasters in terms of kind of who lived, who died, who helped who, and what some of the larger issues were. A lot of the railroad workers complained about safety. They complained about pay. They complained about, there was an article in the labor newspaper in Everett where some of the workers are saying, hey, they hired us to come from Spokane to dig people out of the avalanche, and they just put us to work cleaning the tracks. It's sort of like, well, we didn't come all the way over here to do that, So it's bubbling. So you have this disaster takes place on March 1st. You have this rescue, recovery, the cleanup effort, the recovery of these corpses, the condition the bodies were in, mangled. I mean, if you look at a snowplow and imagine it running, falling over a person with these hundreds of thousands of tons of stuff coming down the mountain, and that in itself added to the trauma, the sort of horror of the condition that these people were found in.
I imagine there were unidentified victims.
Yes, there were. There were a bunch of unclaimed victims and a bunch of unidentified victims, and they were buried in a common plot on Queen Anne Hill. One of the Wellington victims is just past this, just down in that, down there. The reason that cemetery was picked was county cemeteries were all on a rotating basis to take victims like this, and Mount Pleasant happened to be on the list when this happened.
Well, we took a walk in Mount Pleasant Cemetery to look at birds and to see if we could find a tombstone of a victim, and indeed we did.
The date 1910, they have him on the map of the cemetery where historic graves are marked. There were, I think, maybe 15 or so other Wellington victims buried here. Yes, there's a place where people who were unclaimed or unidentified, but there was one of the identified victims was a man named Luigi Cimarusti. And I don't know how you pronounce the name. Luigi, is that? And he has a plaque there. But it doesn't say anything about Wellington, but his death date is 1910. There were, among the victims, there were a number of Italian names, so and probably among the unidentified. I went back to the newspapers to try and find this guy. I finally found a reference to Luigi Gamarsti, who I think is him, and somebody came up with the correct name later on. There's a plaque with his name on it, but the other victims are buried around him.
Knute, after these disasters, was there a reckoning? Was there an investigation?
Yes, there was. The disaster happened within the precincts of King County. So King County held an inquest into the disaster. Basically, you have an inquest jury. They take testimony from the railway company, from witnesses. And, the purpose is to see if they can't pin blame. So the disaster basically took place on March 1st. By the end of the month, a coroner's jury concludes that the catastrophe was due to an agency beyond human control. But it criticizes the railroad for faulty judgment in having placed the 2 stalled trains on the siding that was later swept by the avalanche that cost 88 or more human lives. Further criticism of the railway company is based upon the alleged coal shortage at Wellington and the fact that high enough wages to hold a snow shoveling crew at the scene were refused by the company. So what's interesting here is that the verdict is it was an act of God, but they could have done more. And so this is a result of witnesses, survivors coming and testifying as to what the situation was like there.
It sounds like they said they should have backed the trains into the tunnels.
Well, that was argued. I think the railway seemed to have some pretty good reasons for not doing that, particularly with the passenger train. But there were other sidings they could have been diverted to that would have been less vulnerable, at least in hindsight. So the railroad is somewhat left off gets off the hook in terms of being liable. I did find a news article about a lawsuit that one of the survivors brought, a man named R.M. LaVille, who was a passenger in the ill-fated westbound passenger train. And he was not seriously injured, but he lost all of his baggage, his luggage, and so he filed a claim for $195 in damages against the railroad. And in November of 1910, the headline is, Wellington Horror Act of Providence. In effect, the court held the avalanche was an act of providence against which the railroad company could not guard, and that the officials of the company had shown all possible diligence in endeavoring to prevent loss of life and destruction of property. I think it's important to remember how powerful the railroads were. I mean, this was the lifeline. This was the thing driving growth, driving commerce. The railroad companies were very powerful. They had tremendous influence in Seattle. It's kind of hard to imagine that the railroads would have been taken to task in court the way perhaps they would be today with lawsuits and that kind of thing.
What happened with all the freight that the trains were carrying?
So I don't know the details of this part of it, but I think the freight was all written off, for insurance purposes. But there was a kind of discount retail store in Seattle that got the rights to sell all the stuff that was being shipped out.
At a discount.
At a discount. And it was a hugely popular sale. And they put signs outside that say, Wellington sale. So everybody knew this is stuff from the Wellington disaster.
Oh, my.
Now, this isn't like the personal belongings of folks. This is stuff that was being shipped in the freight cars, a general merchandise, dresses and, things like that. But it was a hugely popular sale. Nobody was shy about getting a bargain, even if it came from what the Seattle Times reporter said was the worst disaster in Pacific Northwest history.
Did anything actually change as a result of this? Were there any reforms? Did the railroad companies learn anything from this? Did they do business differently?
Yeah, they did. I mean, the Great Northern built more snow shelters, avalanche shelters, where you're not building a tunnel exactly, but you're building a sheltered space that can funnel an avalanche away from the tracks, over the tracks. And they were lectured, here's a thing in the PI, saying the safety of the traveling public is a thing of vital moment. And basically saying, the railroad had best learned from the Wellington horror how to make sure this never happens again. And in both the case of the Canadian Pacific at Rogers Pass, the Great Northern at Wellington, both decided to reroute the trains eventually. So the new Cascade tunnel that was built by the Great Northern didn't actually come into use until 1929, but it rendered that part of the line obsolete. The town of Wellington eventually disappeared. Rogers Pass did the same thing. They rerouted their trains through a different route. So they definitely had to invest in assuring the traveling public that they could get you safely across these mountain ranges.
Sort of brings up a contemporary analogy, doesn't it?
It sure does.
Did Boeing put the bolts on? Did they learn anything?
Investigators are still missing critical information from Boeing about that MAX 9 door plug that blew out over Portland.
Exactly. Did they learn anything? Did they do anything?
What are the reforms going to be?
I mean, I think, people felt like the Great Northern Railroad route over Stevens Pass was an engineering marvel of its time. But I think James J. Hill, who ran the company, was also a noted penny pincher. And, and a case in point, these track workers not being able to make a few more cents an hour to help clear the tracks. Not that would have made a difference, but it's just telling about the kind of decision-making that was happening. I think reforms did come about, and public pressure is certainly part of that.
Well, as you say, it's hard for us to imagine how powerful the railroads were back in that day.
Yeah, exactly. And we tend not to think of them now because it's Amtrak or it's various freight train companies. But, even now with, the occasional freight train wreck that produces toxic clouds in a community, it's very slow for reforms to happen. There's still a very powerful railroad lobby, just as there is for aerospace or, the auto industry or anything else. It's often, an uphill fight.
Thanks for listening to Mossback. If you'd like to see all the episodes from this season of Mossback's Northwest, you can find them at cascadepbs.org. The video series is now in its 9th season. A new episode airs on Cascade PBS every Thursday night through May. This episode of Mossback was produced by Sarah Bernard. Our story editor and executive producer is Sarah Menzies. You can subscribe to the Mossback podcast wherever you listen, and whatever platform you're listening on, please review us. We'd love to know what you think of the show. And check out the show notes if you want to get in touch. Also, if you'd like to support the work we do, whether it's our lineup of podcasts, the video docuseries we stream every week, or the in-depth reporting we deliver every day, go to cascadepbs.org. In addition to supporting our journalism, members receive complete access to the on-demand programming of Cascade PBS. And being a member means you can sign up for an exclusive weekly Mossback Den newsletter from Knute Berger, where he offers greater insight into his latest historical discoveries. Mossback is a product of Cascade PBS. I'm Stephen Hegg. We'll be back soon with another episode.